forget Jimmy Stewart. He's not the star of the film. The B-36. We'll argue about this after, but the B-36 is really the star of the movie. It's this ridiculous, like, hybrid mashed together airplane, but the way that the movie itself was just filmed, just absolutely gorgeous. The shots that they have of the B-36 in flight.
Welcome to the Aviation Show, brought to you in association with the Pima Air and Space Museum. David, host of the Cold War channel here on YouTube. How the devil are you, sir?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Warm.
That's I've heard. I can't. Here in sunny Toronto, we're in between heat, so I really can't complain too much. But I hope you have as I said a few seconds ago, I hope you have a nice gin and tonic at some point lined up in your day. So.
Yes, I think that's not too far off in the future. But before we get to the gins and tonics, we've got a fun subject to talk about because we've been bouncing Jimmy Stewart's Strategic Air Command movie back and forth on Bluesky for ages. So we thought we'd take the opportunity to pull it apart, talk about lots of aspects of it. Let's kick this off. What is your sort of memory? What is your sort of feeling about the film as a film of its time?
It's a film that I love the film, and you're not going to hear too many people say that. Like it's I think it's probably well recognized and well renowned as not being a good movie by any stretch. But I do absolutely love the movie. I have incredibly warm feelings and thoughts towards it. I remember watching it for the first time when I was 13 years old. I had been left home alone. My parents had gone out and they'd found a bunch of movies and sort of like, here, entertain yourself, and give me the movies. And that was the one that I picked because it had a big airplane on the cover. And that's, you know what? Perfect. 13 years old, not knowing exactly what I'm interested in at any point, but airplanes are cool. So I put that in and I watch it. 13 years old. I have no real interest in the Cold War at that point, but I can sort of in retrospect, I can almost pinpoint back to where my interest in the Cold War starts, coming from this movie. And it's the B-36 as like the star. Forget Jimmy Stewart. He's not the star of the film. The B-36. We'll argue about this after, but the B-36 is really the star of the movie. It's this ridiculous, like, hybrid mashed together airplane, but the way that the movie itself was just filmed, cinematography. There we go. I get there eventually. It's just absolutely gorgeous. The shots that they have of the B-36 in flight, airplane pornography, as I've referred to it in the past. And so I watched it when I was 13 years old and fascinated by it, and sort of like start going down the rabbit hole of why this, like, trying to figure out why this movie is what it is and why is it giving this rah rah hurrah type thing. And conversations with my parents about it, and it's like, yes, that's what you call propaganda. And that's my mother giving me that look of like, you're an idiot. That you don't recognize this. And then it goes on the back burner in the back of my brain for several decades, and I come back to it later as an adult and someone who's taking a more academic and more keen interest in the time period in which the movie's filmed, and coming back to it and realizing that I still love this movie for all the camp reasons for it, and for all the 1950s propaganda value, and for the cinematography and everything that goes into it. But it's such a putting that historical context to the movie that have been later able to do as an adult really has solidified it in my mind as being this magnificent piece of 1950s ephemera, for lack of a better word. So I mean, in terms of if there's listeners and viewers out there who haven't seen the movie, you should absolutely rectify that. If you can get it in Blu-ray, it's absolutely gorgeous to watch. It's available in lower res versions. You can find them online. I think the Internet Archive has a copy of it floating around there. Yeah. But it is just a gorgeous, bad 1950s propaganda film. So
I agree totally. I think it's a little bit more interesting than just bad. But we're gonna get into that. I think the thing that sells it is the B-36 was made to be shot in VistaVision, which is the big format sort of things, because those early scenes when they do the one takeoff, one landing trip to Alaska, just absolutely gorgeous. For an airplane, I think is a complete and utter waste of time, but we'll argue about that in a minute.
We'll absolutely argue about that because I agree and I disagree entirely, which is the way that this is supposed to work. So, like a true historian, I agree and I disagree. So, no, it's this fantastic movie that's like shot to highlight a like sort of like the evolving technology and like obviously the B-47, which I know you're keen on like bringing into things.
Yes.
The B-47 like it's its introduction into it, and it's this beautiful piece of propaganda that's targeting a very specific group for very specific purposes, and I'm sure we'll talk about.
So I guess for those people who, amazingly, for this channel, might not have watched the film, do you want to give us a quick précis of I'm doing air quotes if you're listening to the audio version when I say plot. It's not plot heavy.
it's very deep. It's very intricate. 13-year-old me was able to follow it immediately, so it clearly isn't that complicated. So the rough breakdown of sort of the entire plot line is you've got Dutch, who's he's a professional baseball player. He's the oldest looking professional baseball player I've ever seen, played by Jimmy Stewart. And he's a retired. He's not a retired. He's a reserve Second World War pilot, exactly like Jimmy Stewart, who's in the midst of his baseball career is recalled back to active duty by Strategic Air Command to come back as a pilot. And he's recalled. He's just recently married, like a few months married to June Allison, who I can't stand as an actress, but that's a completely separate podcast for a completely separate channel. And he gets recalled back, and it goes through like a series of little like stories, and like it's like, well, why is this necessary? And it's it's like, why we're not at war right now. This is 1955, by the way. We're not at war. It's like, so why do I have to come back? And he's very reluctant to come back, but he's forced to, and he's pulled out from his baseball career, comes back to start flying. He's introduced back onto to check out on the B-36, which he's completely blown away by. Like he's never seen such a gorgeous and wonderful aircraft. And they go through all of this. There's a General Hawks is introduced at one point, and General Hawks is very clearly the stand-in for Curtis LeMay. Love him or hate him, sometimes a bit of both. But he's introduced, and there's very much these set piece lines that get set up in terms of introducing why Strategic Air Command, which is what Jimmy Stewart's character is flying for, why it exists and what its purpose is, and what it's doing to defend America and defend democracy in the free world, and all of those great speaking points from the post Red Scare 1950s. And then it moves to from the B-36. He goes through there's an accident that Dutch, the base, that Jimmy Stewart's character is involved in, where he hurts himself, but it's this very noble and heroic sort of accident and rescue thing from the base in Greenland, and moves on to the introduction of the B-47, where Jimmy Stewart's character gets to move from the B-36 to start flying the B-47s, despite the fact that he's hiding an injury that he suffered during the crash, because apparently doctors aren't doing their jobs or something in SAC. That's a Mack truck size plot hole that we're just going to overlook because that's how these things work.
Which he sort of waves away by saying to his wife, "You know what flight surgeons are like," and you're like,
"Yeah, that's it." Yeah, it makes me laugh every time I see that because it's like, okay, like I actually do know what flight surgeons are like, and there's no way that you're getting through this. But anyways, that's moving along. Flies the B-47. He ends up having like a flare up with his injured shoulder on a long range like mission with the B-47 that he can no longer escape like anybody else knowing about it, and he's forcibly retired out from Strategic Air Command. But it's very much this big striking speech that it's like that he will always continue to support Strategic Air Command and the mission and defend America, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of and interspersed between all these this very straightforward, message is his wife doesn't like that he's rejoined Strategic Air Command. She supports him anyways, and then she's a fervent believer in Strategic Air Command and the sort of the mission. So like it's winning the family over and all these things as well. So it's very 1950s in its feel in terms of how there's a challenge, like there's the sort of the crescendo to it, and the expected denouement that it's all going to end happily and in the right patriotic, correct way. So, and of course, interspersed with all that is beautiful, beautiful footage of aircraft in flight, which is really the reason that I watched the movie at this point. So,
And, you know, it's people think now of US military involvement in films, whether it's, say, Michael Bay level or Tom Cruise level with the Top Gun movies. This has those beat by a long way. Those opening shots of when the B-36 is taxiing out, and there are literally tens and dozens of B-36 at readiness. Same with the B-47 later. The scale of this film is obscene, frankly.
it is phenomenal. So, I mean, Strategic Air Command, which up until the mid to late 50s was headed by Curtis LeMay. Love him or hate him. He was actually the instigator, if we want to say. Like, he actually proposed that the movie be developed, written and developed for we can go into it. Like, I don't know if you want to talk about it now or in a little bit.
Yeah, so to be fair, you've done more to talk about what little plot there is than I think anyone else could possibly do. But I think because we can get into the making of it, and this point is huge, really. That it's this might as well just have a Curtis LeMay production on the first title.
It absolutely is. Like, LeMay absolutely like triggers, like, you know, the making of this movie. He proposes that the script be written by, I can never remember the gentleman's name, but Bernie Lay
was one of the guys. Yeah, and one of the guys that did 12 O'Clock High, wasn't it?
It was. He proposes to Bernie Lay to write this screenplay. Jimmy Stewart was pretty much on board from day one. Again, for the odd person who may not know, especially watching this channel, Jimmy Stewart himself was a reserve Air Force pilot. Had flown I can never remember if it was B-24s or B-25s in the Second World War.
24s.
Was it 24s? Perfect.
Yeah.
Staying with Consolidated. So he was a B-24 decorated pilot from the Second World War, flew 20 plus missions, and remained as a reserve officer after the end of the Second World War. Prior to the start of the Cold War, he stayed in uniform, and he very much saw the movie very much on board, and he saw it as a way to promote the Air Force and to promote the role that's of bombers, really, because I mean, this is I'm going to use the term bomber mafia, and please don't connotate that at all with the fine, excellent book of the same name that was recently published. But it was very much like the Air Force at that point was the senior leadership within the Air Force was very much coming out of the bomber community, and he was very much Jimmy Stewart himself was very much on board with the messaging and sort of the ideas, the concepts of strategic bombing at the time. The quote that Jimmy Stewart gave in terms of after he'd read the screenplay was that he considered it, quote, a unique opportunity to combine some much needed public education with a lot of entertainment. And really where that public education framework comes in is not necessarily like education about what the bomber does. I think everyone's had a pretty good idea of that, but explaining the concepts and the ideas of deterrence theory, which is very much, that's the underlying message that gets written throughout the entire movie, is that it is all about deterrence without ever actually using the words. I don't believe the word deterrence is actually used at all once through the film at all. But that's very much what the movie is promoting, is this idea that of deterrence theory in the early 1950s, where the United States had to remain strong in order to offset any possible attacks from the evil Soviet Union. So LeMay absolutely proposed like the film, like he gets like buy-in from obviously from the screenwriter, from a really significant movie star in Jimmy Stewart, and then he arranges to allow free and open access for the actual studio to come in and film on base, to use aircraft, to setting up flights to be able to capture the film footage that's used, the VistaVision film that's used in the movie itself, all the way through to the point that the movie premiere was actually held at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, which struck me as a huge surprise, because the middle of Nebraska doesn't strike me as the place where anything premieres. Maybe a new tractor. I'm going to get angry email at this point, but that's to the point that like the Air Force was absolutely like the biggest sponsor and the biggest vehicle to allow the movie to be made in the first place. So, and that's all with Kurt LeMay's backing as the commander of SAC. So,
and if anyone is, we keep saying VistaVision. Basically, what VistaVision is if you think of a normal 35 millimeter film, basically they turn it sideways so that they can shoot extra widescreen long using the same film stock, as opposed to 70 millimeter IMAX, which we consider, or Cinerama before that. So it just means they can get really big shots with lots and lots of color density into it, which is my film studies geekiness coming out.
Of course, VistaVision would be necessary for the B-36 because it is an absolute beast of an aircraft. That thing is absolutely enormous. Some of my favorite pictures, I'm going to go on a little tangent here, but some of my favorite pictures are like aerial shots of B-36 sitting on the tarmac with like on an apron, whatnot, ramp. That's the word I'm looking for. Sitting on the ramp with a B-29 and a B-17 next to them. And if you've ever been next to a B-17, they look quite big and imposing, and the B-17 looks minuscule in comparison to the B-36. It's really quite phenomenal, like those comparison shots. So
yeah, I remember the first time we went out to Pima, and I walked down the flight line, and you're like, "Well, B-52 is big. B-52 is big." And then you get past them, and then there is this B-36, which is, I'm going to say it, oddly proportioned. I'm trying to be polite, as I know how it's like, because it's just basically a long cigar with a massive wing with loads of engines that weren't supposed to be pusher engines strapped onto it, and 4 jet engines added because why not?
I mean, to go into the whole B-36 story, I think this is probably, I mean, if we're just chatting about this, it's probably this is a nice segue into sort of how the B-36.
We're keeping this light and friendly.
Perfect. That's my motto in life, particularly. B-36 actually was first proposed as early as 1940, before the U.S. had even entered into before the U.S. had entered into the Second World War, looking at sort of the progress of what the Germans were doing. There was a recognized possible need for a true intercontinental bomber, something that would be able to take off from bases in the United States, conduct bombing missions over Europe, and be able to still return to base without the idea that basically it was predicated on the idea that England was going to fall and that the bases there wouldn't be available. So there was this long range thinking. So obviously in 1940, this is pre-jet engine. This is really like even sort of like large scale pressurized cabins, whatnot. So this is very much this idea that we're going to build something that's never really been looked at before in terms of size and scale, and that's how it hits the drawing board in its early conception. Obviously, the B-29 is introduced prior to that because it takes necessity as the result of the exigencies of the Second World War. And lots of things that they learned from the B-29 are applied into the development of the B-36, especially around pressurized cabins and whatnot. Onboard guns, like built-in like guns, whatnot. All of these things are incorporated into the B-36. So by the time that it actually starts, like it actually takes flight in 1948, I believe. It's this 6-engine pusher prop configuration with problematic engines and the major wasps. Like highly, if you thought the B-29 development surrounding the engines on the B-29 was problematic, incredibly problematic with the B-36, and continued to be for the entire lifespan of it. But of course, in between the drawing board in 1940 and the first flight in 1948, the jet age has begun, and the jet engines in their earliest forms are inefficient. They're absolute fuel hogs, like all of those thrust weight. There's all kinds of issues in that around them. But it was recognized very quickly that the B-36 was, even by its first flight, was probably out of date in terms of what it was had to do. So they rejigged and re-rigged the aircraft to retrofit them with jet engines. So it ended up with 6 pusher prop configured major WASP engines, and these 4 two on each wing outboard jet engines in pods, and everything was problematic because you've got to rewire the whole plane. Everything early jets could be temperamental at the best of times, and the B-36 basically ended up with six turning, 4 burning was sort of the unofficial motto for the aircraft. So the six prop planes and 4 burning jets. But it ended up like basically a lot of people joking as a result of all the issues that it was 2 burning. It basically goes off and like a bunch of them are like unaccounted for. It's this absolute mess of an aircraft. But it was the only aircraft that was available at the time, and we'll get into that, I think, as part of this later discussion. But the B-36 really starts off as this idea that it's going to be a long-range intercontinental bomber to be able to conduct bombing missions from North America to the European continent. And that, surprisingly, unsurprisingly, depending on exactly where your line is, the B-36, that ends up actually being its core mission, except that it wasn't Germany, the skies of Germany that it needed to reach. It was going to be the skies of the Soviet Union that it needed to reach. But it was the only long-range bomber that had enough fuel capacity and enough payload capacity to be able to actually carry a significant bomb load to be able to hit targets in the Soviet Union and still be able to return to base. And it's the only one until the introduction of the B-52 in the the first flight of the B-52 was 1953. Don't quote me. Everybody can get mad at me about that, 50, but it's the early 1950s. Is it 52? It's the early 1950s by the time that the first B-52 takes off. And it's already been slated as the direct replacement for the B-36. But there's this almost 10-year gap. There's an 8-year gap, basically, let's say, where the B-36 is the only thing that's going in terms of being able to strike at or deter the proposed enemy. So
I suppose we should really talk about SAC for a second.
Sure.
We've talked about the film. We've talked about their sort of mainline aircraft come that sort of turn of the 40s into 50s. What was SAC's mission? Because I think when it was formed and what LeMay turned it into were slightly different things.
Yeah, so SAC, and this builds on sort of what I was just talking about a couple of seconds ago, couple of minutes ago, probably because I ramble. Strategic Air Command was formed in the immediate post-war period as the coming out of it's a direct successor to like the bomber forces of the Second World War. So I mean, think of 20th Air Force and in the Pacific, and then 8th Air Force in Europe. It's the direct successor to that in terms of being the main strike weapon of the United States to be able to carry strategic bombing as a strategy to the enemy. It's set up as a major command within the United States Air Force. Once the USAF is actually formed as an independent service branch. SAC actually predates the formation of the USAF, but the way that formation was, everybody out here already knows it, but the United States Air Force was really its own independent service for much of the Second World War anyways, but once that was actually formally structured, SAC is created in 1946. The United States Air Force is formally established in 1947, but SAC is already in this existing major command. And its mission is, as I said, the primary strike arm of the United States military to be able to carry the air war to any proposed opponent. Especially post 1945, it is the sole delivery vehicle for for atomic and nuclear weapons. There's the Army, the Air Force is the only service branch that has access to those weapons. They hadn't been turned into land weapons yet, and certainly they weren't available for the Navy as of yet either. It starts off in its early days under the command of General Kenny, who is far more interested in, he was very much a political general. He spent his post-war couple of years, instead of focusing on SAC, was trying to coordinate and set up a United Nations Air Force, believe it or not. His split attention plus the combination of severe demobilization in the post-war period ends up where the Air Force in general, but SAC specifically, loses the majority of their trained personnel. So that really well-honed strike force that exists within 8th Air Force, 20th Air Force, within the bomber commands at the end of by the end of the Second World War, have all gone back to civilian life, and it ends up where the degradation of force that's available to the U.S. Air Force is really severe. When Kurt LeMay is selected to take over SAC in 1948, he was the head of United States Air Force Europe. He was the commander. He actually helped set up the Berlin airlift. He was the commander in charge at the time. He was recalled from that role to take over SAC during the early days of the Berlin airlift, as the deeper realization within Washington that the Soviets really were posing quite a substantial threat. So when General LeMay takes over at SAC, he comes in, and one of the first things that he does is he orders a mission, and it's like drop of a hat. There's no pre-announcement of it. He orders a full strike mission, every single available aircraft and crew, to run a mock attack on Dayton, Ohio. Poor Dayton was the subject of a massive attack from every plane that was available within Strategic Air Command. They staged the attack. Not a single aircraft or crew managed to put a mock bomb within 1 mile of the target. Not a single crew, which LeMay then uses as a cudgel
to be able to go back to his superiors at the Air Force. It's Vandenberg. He uses that as proof that like they need to basically do a complete teardown, and SAC needs to be completely rebuilt. And LeMay is absolutely the person to do this. So he starts off with poor staff, poor retention. He's got poor flying skills for many of the pilots. It's all the result of like wide-scale funding cut that came in the post-Second World War period. And it's all fueled by demobilization, where people like basically like no one's staying in uniform to provide that continuity of experience and whatnot to teach new people coming in. Everyone got the hell out, and no one's got anything. There's none of this like institutional knowledge that wide scale that remains. LeMay uses the results of this Dayton attack to effectively almost within a year to completely turn the organization around. Which, if for anybody who knows anything about how a large scale institution works, a year to turn an organization around is incredible. Not to mix a service metaphor here, but think of it as trying to turn a battleship on a dime. LeMay doesn't quite do that, but he very much is trying to do that with pretty good results.
So LeMay does this really radical thing within a conscription military, in that he starts actually treating the servicemen under his command as actual people. And he's doing that there's two reasons. He believes in doing that. Like he's a career soldier himself. He understands what rough conditions and all these types of things are, to be in service and not have the support of the organization that you work for. But at the same time, he also looks at it as a longer term project in terms of making sure that SAC has the ability to operate at peak functionality. And he does things as simple as quote unquote as simple as improved housing, making sure that SAC facilities, which often tended to be in really remote and terrible places to be. If you've ever heard of, it was called Thule. In Greenland, it's not exactly the most happening hotspot in the world. I know that it's Pituffik, I think, which is a space force base at this point. Don't even get me started on that. But Thule starts off as a SAC base, and you only got posted there really if you had done something really bad. But in terms of how LeMay treated it, he wanted people's experience in uniform to be as not necessarily as benign as possible, but at least if you were going to be working at an incredibly high performance rate, that you were compensated appropriately. And that meant good facilities on base. It meant better pay. It meant the opportunity for spot promotions for exceptional service. Lots of things that aren't happening anywhere else within the U.S. military at that time.
If you are an aviation buff and in the southwestern United States, visiting the Pima Air and Space Museum has to be top of your list. Not only are there over 400 aircraft there, including some unique types like the oldest B-52 in existence, the NB-52A mothership, the High and Mighty one, which carried X-15s aloft 72 times to set speed records that have never been broken on the edge of space. Pima Air and Space Museum is open 362 days a year and has everything an aviation geek could want. So do check out www.pimaair.org for more information. And of course, if you get bored with the planes, there are tanks across the street as well. this all feeds straight into the film, doesn't it? That all of these points for making things better. At the beginning of the film, everybody's complaining about it. In the middle of the film, they're talking about things getting better.
Yeah.
And by the end, it's everybody's staying in because it's a whole different world. It's so much better.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very much like that. It's part of the reason that I actually really like to tie things back. It's part of the reason I really like the movie, knowing now what I know about sort of the historical development of SAC, is that it's not particularly like subtle, but if you don't know the history, like it just sort of blows over you. If you understand the history, it's very much like beating you over the head with exactly what LeMay has done. I don't know how much input he actually had on the script, but clearly he's coming out looking pretty good through this. But the idea again is to make sure that you've got, like, to increase retention rates within the organization, to make sure that institutional knowledge stays within the organization, because that's really one of those key things in terms of making sure that you have high levels of performance, is that you've got well experienced, well trained people who want to be doing the job. And you had to be all of those things for SAC. If somebody failed, whether it was somebody like a crew chief, whether it was somebody working on the flight line, whether it was a pilot, a gunner, bombardier, whatever, if you made any type of mistake within a mission that could be attributed to you directly or possibly even indirectly, you were booted from SAC. And that was very much a standard operating procedure for the entirety of the time that LeMay was there, but that continued on throughout the rest of the Cold War as well. There's lots of stories of how things have changed in since then, but certainly at the time, it's like any kind of snafu was treated very, very seriously, including pilots not having to explain personally to LeMay why an accident happened. LeMay had a reputation as being terrifying, is probably a pretty accurate word, to be honest. But being called to the carpet to explain why you dumped your aircraft, whose engine caught fire, and why you weren't able to deal with that engine fire, that would be a terrifying experience following what was probably already a traumatic experience. So making sure that you've got all your, to put it mildly, to put all your ducks in a line, dotted your I's and crossed your T's, and do all those things in advance, that was very much in everyone's best interest. And the SAC saw the results coming from that. The accident rates plummeted, retention rates and re-enlistment rates skyrocketed, and SAC was seen as being a desirable command to be a part of within the Air Force. It had a reputation as, especially in the 1950s, it had a reputation as being the elite people who wanted to be in uniform. That's where they went, and that's where they ended up. It moves from 48 to 72 hours to get a plane into the air in the mid 1940s. Eventually, it actually hits where there's 24-hour airborne alert, where there's aircraft loaded with nuclear weapons. I think it's up to anywhere up to 25% of the bomber force was in the air at any given moment by the late 1950s. That includes B-36s flying, but especially that's after the introduction of the B-52. But that's very much this. You don't get that level of performance with that mid 1940s performance reviews that you're getting from your crews and your line crews and whatnot at that time. So it's he really does turn this SAC. LeMay really does turn SAC into this premier fighting force that is perpetually on a wartime footing. That's hopefully the segue that we're going for here, by the way, Matt. This perpetually on a wartime footing situation that LeMay institutes, that type of efficiency and that level of performance is absolutely what's required of that. So
it's that sort of, as you say, the sea change of performance. The line is going up for SAC, and I think saying LeMay is terrifying is interesting, because that perception of him within SAC and within the Air Force as his continual rise, this the perpetual readiness that sort of bleeds into the arch proponent of MAD, of mutually assured destruction. He goes from the stern leader, scary leader within the Air Force to almost this comic book villain, very much so that he becomes General Ripper in Doctor Strangelove. How does his public persona go in that way, because he would have been known in the Second World War for the work he did with the 8th, and then with the 21st and the 20th, dropping the bomb. Now he's, after a period of time of kicking SAC into shape, he's back in front of especially the US media, because he's not shy of standing in front of a camera, is he?
He's definitely not. He does the regular lecture unit like circuit, and he's very, very out there in terms of speaking, both when he was the head of SAC, but also afterwards when he's promoted to be vice chief of the Air Force and then eventually chief of the Air Force, which is a post he held for quite a long time, all things considered, across several administrations, including going from a Republican administration into the Kennedy administration. And I mean, LeMay and Kennedy certainly did not see eye to eye on anything. Possibly anything. They may have agreed on a few things, but LeMay is very much, he's very outspoken. He's very forward in terms of expressing his opinions and his thoughts on everything happening within the Air Force, and as well as international relations. He's also smart enough not to ever go over past the line. He's not MacArthur. He's not going to sort of disobey direct commands. He knows how to play the politics, but he also knows how far. He's got a very good sense of how far he can push things. But in terms of that, going from that scary, terrifying, ultra efficient hero of the 1950s into being lampooned as General Ripper in Dr. Strangelove. As a side note, there's a fairly good contention that General Ripper is actually more a parody of Tommy Power, who was LeMay's second in command and then took over SAC after LeMay was promoted to vice chief of the Air Force. But that's a whole other conversation. LeMay is very much recognized as being sort of a model for General Ripper. And a lot of that shift has to do with, I think, public perception of nuclear weapons in general, as the Cold War is evolving and changing through the 1950s. It's easy to be the tough guy when your opponent isn't seen as being able to effectively strike back, or they're only able to strike back in a limited way, which was very much the case in the early to mid 1950s, where the Soviets had a fairly small strategic air force. They never really had a huge bomber fleet, despite what the bomber gap may try to tell you. That Soviet Air Force was, at the strategic level, was always quite small. They had a limited number of atomic weapons and then thermonuclear weapons that they had access to at any given point. And it's as I said, it's easy to look like you're the tough guy when that's the situation. When that suddenly starts beginning to fade away and to dissipate as ICBM technology resets the equation, and as nuclear parity comes into place between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and an atomic or even certainly a nuclear exchange is no longer deemed to be quote unquote winnable. It's a laughable statement in and of itself. Suddenly the person that was advocating that, yeah, we can win a nuclear exchange, he doesn't look so tough and so correct anymore, so much as he looks genocidal in some ways. It's very easy to take the shine off somebody when what they're advocating could result in the deaths of literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. So I think that's to me, that's very much the impression that I get in terms of where LeMay's star, where that shine starts to come off. It very much corresponds across the advancements in technology and ability and capability that the Soviets exude, as opposed to anything that the Americans have changed. So
there's fun conversations to be had about Canadian intelligence reports compared to CIA ones on the bomber gap, which leads into the Avro-Aero cancellation and all of that good stuff. Yeah, there's definitely a few episodes in discussing that, but the sort of technological grabbiness of LeMay is quite something, because in Strategic Air Command you have, this is the film, you've got the B-36 starting, you've got the sort of Star Wars-esque reveal of the B-47, which is whispered at the beginning of the film, and they have a stopover in Wichita and they go into the hangar, and there is a gleaming, beautiful, streamlined medium jet bomber which blows Jimmy Stewart's socks off. And then at the end of the film, there's a model of a YB-52A sitting on General Hawks' his desk. And then, of course, we can go on to B-58 Hustler, XB-70 Valkyrie. He was just wanting more all the time. And, by the time he was, I think ousted might be a little bit harsh, but by the time he was finally convinced to retire, he had pushed the Air Force in some weird and wonderful ways when it came, especially to bombers.
Yeah, I mean, LeMay, I don't have the details in terms of all sort of the more oddball sort of proposals that he tried to fund and tried to get off. The dyna-soar is sort of like the one of the big ones that I always think of. But
nuclear B-36 never had to land.
Yeah, let's not think about what happens when it crashes, because that's never going to happen, right? There's all these different sort of proposals, like nuclear powered cruise missiles. Like that's a thing that the Air Force, they're looking for low Earth orbit. They're basically pushing into Space Force territory. Low Earth orbit strike vehicles, like all kinds of crazy things that LeMay is.
dyna-soar.
I think it's. I don't have the details on it, but I think it's either dyna-soar or I can't remember which, but it was.
Because a couple of the Gemini pilot crew were guys that had transferred off of that program.
Yeah. Even the XB-70 Valkyrie, which was absolutely LeMay's baby through like its entire development and through its cancellation. He treated that so seriously, and took it as a personal affront. Really took it as a personal affront when Kennedy opted to like finally kill the program. Interestingly, that's when the Cuban Missile Crisis was starting to actually come out. The early days, LeMay was in Europe on a speaking tour, and they needed to get him back to North America without alerting any of the intelligence agencies that there was something big cooking. And what they ended up using was they sent him a telegram basically saying that the XB-70 funding was going to be like Kennedy was threatening to cut the funding again. So immediately, LeMay hops on a plane, comes back, and that's how they got him back to North America. That's how seriously he treated new bomber programs, and he was a missile. He turned into a missile advocate because he had to, not because he wanted to. He always believed that the pilot should be, that you needed like a pilot there, both to deal with, it's like emergent situations and changing situations leading into the moment, before the moment of actual detonation. A pilot can abort at any point up until when they actually drop the bomb. Whereas an ICBM, once you turn the keys, that's it. There's no recalling on that. So it's LeMay was a big believer in having a pilot in the seat for as much as possible. And he really did firmly believe in technological advancement and all those things. And I think the list that you gave, like in terms of how the movie outlines those, is actually a really good example of that.
Yeah, I am horrified, fascinated, enthralled by Kurt LeMay. His arc from artillery officer to comic book villain by the end of his life is just a remarkable rise. And even when he leaves the Air Force, you can't really call it a fall. He's just still this public figure within politics and things. And we won't get into his abortive run for president, things like that. But his shadow, probably B-52, still going. One of his.
Absolutely. It's turning into a joke at this point. The re-engining, the continual, perpetual re-engining of the B-52. They'll still we're going to end up with long range space flight, and the B-52 is going to be part of that program. Like we're all quite convinced of that at this point. But it's interesting in terms of that long. You use the word long shadow. The long shadow that the man has absolutely carried. For my sins, I have joined a couple of B-36 and Strategic Air Command appreciation groups on Facebook. And Facebook, of course, being the wonderfully neutral social media site that it is, it's this constant litany that I see of comments, and this, I mean, this is apocryphal data. You can't use this in any sort of scientific setting or anything, but it's this constant like referral of people making comments that LeMay would never stand for X, Y, Z. Things were better things were better when LeMay was in command because there was no bullshit, no messing around, like none of that. It was very much that long shadow that he cast. And I'll be honest, like I go in and I look at the profiles of the people who are making some of these comments because I'm always curious. And none of them are old enough that they've served under LeMay. Like LeMay left SAC in the mid 1950s. These would have been people that were served in SAC maybe in the 70s or even in the 80s. And that ghost of Curtis LeMay, still alive at the time, but the ghost of Curtis LeMay absolutely loomed large over the entire organization for its entire lifespan. SAC was disbanded. I think it's now part of it's what's morphed into Stratcom. But Strategic Air Command, I want to say 1991, 91 or 92, but with the end of the Cold War. The need
90,
to have
92. He says quickly Googling it on his phone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're well prepared for this conversation, ladies and gentlemen. We both watched the film, and I'm throwing David under the bus with all these other questions.
Hopefully I'm doing some justice to it all here, but
you're doing great. Yeah.
It's very much this long shadow that he casts over the organization, that people who, like, he had been out of SAC for 30 years and people still feared the idea that LeMay could come back and kick everybody's ass. Like, it really is this this incredible sort of like legacy that he has. My own personal thoughts on the man, I'm fascinated by him, but not always in a good way necessarily. He's a fascinating monster, if that makes sense. Yeah. He was absolutely convinced and committed to the idea that the Cold War could be won, and if it cost 100 million lives, but there was still more Americans left at the end of that exchange, then that was fine. Which it very much stems out of his experience during the Second World War, especially with when you look at how both his time in Europe and in Japan. So there is a logical progression in terms of that thinking, but certainly sitting for myself in 2026 and looking at all this, it's just it's such an alien thought process to me. Even understanding where the thought process evolved from. So yeah, I find him to be absolutely fascinating for a lot of some good reasons, like for anyone who's works in the business world, like change management. He's a perfect example of someone who's capable of like driving ahead with change management within an organization. But at the same time, he's also an absolute monster, as I said. So just in terms of what he would have been willing to do, including usurp and bypass presidential authority to launch a nuclear strike, which doesn't get talked about quite as much as I think it should. But there's a couple of really good source material, some good analysis that have been done. Trevor Albertson's Winning Armageddon is an excellent take a look at LeMay's on-record willingness to launch preemptive strikes if he deemed them necessary. So, yeah,
I think in my notes I sent you, I just called him the arch pragmatist.
Yeah, absolutely. He's absolutely fascinating. I sort of going back to being 13-year-old me and watching watching Strategic Air Command and seeing General Hawks, and I wish I could think back to what I thought of him at that point. But then sort of in the last 7 to 8 years, I've done a lot more reading on LeMay and like the Strategic Air Command as an organization and nuclear deterrence theory and all those things that sort of build around that in the late 1940s, the late 1950s. And he remains an absolutely fascinating character to me. And the most surprising thing about all of that is that as of yet, and that I'm aware of, there is still no academic or critical biography of LeMay that's ever been written. There's a couple of different hagiographies that have been written of him, which are largely mirror his own biography, his autobiography that he wrote, because he didn't write it. He barely read it before it went to proof. And he admitted that afterwards. There's the example of that, like the the famous quote that that has always been attributed to him, that if he had the ability to sort of like hands off in Southeast Asia, he would bomb them back to the Stone Age. Like that's sort of the famous quote that's attributed to LeMay. That was made up by the biographer, his ghostwriter. LeMay never actually said that. He admits that after the fact, and it's because in his words, he didn't have time to read his own biography. But unfortunately, a lot of the hagiography, the two significant hagiographies that have been written about him, are largely based off of his autobiography. And what I would really love to see coming out, ideas for people who have more time and knowledge and skill than I have, would be getting into like a lot of the released declassified documentation that's coming out from the period, and getting and actually doing a proper critical biography of the man, because I think there's what we know of him, I think very much is sort of the surface level, and there's a lot more there to mine and to dig into.
Which makes you wonder just what that John Milius script of his film about LeMay would be like, because I'm pretty sure poor old John was a big fan of of Curtis LeMay's outlook. So whatever is in that mad script, which I would love to read just for fair shits and giggles, it'll never get made, but just for what he and someone of a similar outlook would have written about LeMay would be fascinating to get your hands on.
I mean, I almost, part of me almost thinks that it would be like Dr. Strangelove, except Ripper is the hero. So,
yeah. Which oddly, now that you put it like that, I'd be there to see. I'd buy that ticket.
I would absolutely be there on opening night for sure. Like that's, it would just be me, because my wife would absolutely not go anywhere near the movie. But that's fine. So.
Yeah, and then mine would be, "What's it about?" And I'd explain it, and she'd just be like, "Have fun, darlings."
Yeah,
I'll meet you in the pub afterwards.
That's
so. Let's bring this back to Jimmy Stewart and Strategic Air Command. There's, like we said, it's an odd film. We haven't had a chance to talk about the weird birth rate subplot that keeps coming up through it. There's weird stuff in that movie, but if you could have one clip from it, and that's the clip that survives, what is that moment in the film that just always lives rent free?
It's the Vista. It has to be. It's the VistaVision footage of the B-36 taking off in flight and landing, which is that, as far as I'm aware, this hasn't changed. It is the only remaining surviving footage of a B-36 in flight. Lots of still images, obviously, and a quick Google search will find lots of those. But the actual in-flight video footage of it, that's the only surviving footage. It's gorgeous. It has lived rent-free in my head since 1990 when I first watched that movie. I've just given away how old I am. If the gray hair didn't give it away, that just gave the ghost up completely. But that has to be the footage, the scene, the footage, everything that sort of lasts, that would have to survive from that film, because it really is. For such a, as you said, it's a strange film in a lot of ways, but it's very much a movie of its time. It's hitting all those 1950s propaganda pieces where there's worries about, the role of women. There's the worries about the birth rate. There's worries about they never say it, but it's always the underlying, the specter of communism, and it's sort of the ghost of McCarthy. That's really only HUAC has only really been closed for a little bit. There's lots of things that are sort of that weave through that as this wonderfully weird snapshot of what white America must have looked like in the 1950s. So,
yeah, I'm always fascinated because it comes, I think, just towards the end of the run of films Jimmy Stewart made with Anthony Mann, the Man from Laramie, things like that, and seeing that sort of package of films that they made together. This is just this oddball right in the middle of it. It's quite sorry. For me, if you want to know, it's the B-47 Elephant one.
Okay. Yep. That's
that when they're doing the mass takeoff. That's something. But I do want to say, I still think my favorite gag, I have two. I'm going to throw it. My two favorite gags in the film. One's a mistake because Jimmy Stewart's Dutch Holland is supposed to be a B-29 pilot. When he's waxing lyrical about the B-36 to his wife, he starts talking about the B-24, and you're like, yeah, okay, well, there you go, Jimmy. Yeah. Throw your own plane in there, buddy. But the other one is the 2 takeoff sequences. You've got, it must be 30 seconds long of the B-36 lumbering along the runway at Fort Worth with all the Convair factories in the background. It just goes on and on and on. They do the same thing with the B-47, and they've got the JTOW bit. So it's like, end of the runway, jets, hit the rockets, we're airborne. And it's like, 15 seconds. That's how you show the future.
It's funny that the B-36, like I've done a bit of reading in terms of the part of the development process of the aircraft and whatnot, and that those extra massively long runways that they need to be able to accommodate the B-36, one of the proposed designs to try to offset the massive pressure, the pressure from the weight of the aircraft, was to put tractors, tread gear instead of an actual just like tires, and it worked, but it needed like an extra like few thousand, even on top of what they already needed. They needed an extra few thousand feet of runway to be able to do that. And apparently the noise that it made was so terrifying to everybody on the ground and in the plane that it basically got shelved. Like almost immediately, the idea is like, no, we can't do this because it's scaring the living crap out of everybody. So they immediately shelved it. But if you go to Google and you just do a Google image search for B-36 with tractor landing gear, it's a really bizarre looking like setup, but it's quite fascinating to see that. So,
and it's nuts that the main gear that's just like 8 big wheels, 4 on either side, that big an airplane on. Anyway, let's call it on here. Everybody should go watch Strategic Air Command because it's weirdly fascinating, and it's peak propaganda because it is so beautiful to look at. You kind of get drawn in. It's bright. There's colors. You got beautiful airplanes, and you've got Jimmy Stewart doing peak sort of stoic Jimmy Stewart, haven't you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's everyone. I love aviation films. For a lot, I mean, Top Gun is such a great movie. Top Gun's got something for the boys. It's got something for the girls. It's got something for everybody that's in there. Strategic Air Command may be a little more niche, but it's definitely worth your time if you consider yourself at all to be an airplane aficionado, or a Cold War aficionado. If you're really interested in the period, it's such a great snapshot and such a great, interesting look at a really bizarre transitional period in time, because that the aircraft itself is this transitional aircraft, and it really does sort of highlight and encompass a lot of what was happening within America at the time. So
fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day to geek out about a very weird movie, and a very weird man in Curtis LeMay. If we can sneak preview, what have you got coming up on the Cold War channel?
So I have been working on a couple of different scripts recently, taking a look at NATO in perpetual crisis, which feels a little bit too 2026 to be particularly comfortable, but that's part of the reason that we're working on something. Got something that's just sort of like a short piece that I want to put together, but I've been mulling that one over for a bit. As a longer term project, I'm looking to hopefully get over to Central Europe, do a little bit of on-site filming for a couple of different ideas that we've got. So hopefully, if things work out, and then Poland, here I come. So
brilliant. Well, maybe I'll have to pop over and have a beer with you.
Please.
Yes, as the faff to get my Canadian passport renewed to get back into Canada is insane. I'm probably going to be easier to see you in Poland. So there we go.
I'll look forward to it. First round's on me. So.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us. Until next time. Bye-bye. Oh, and check out the Cold War channel because it's ace. So there we go. Bye-bye everybody.
Cheers.
I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished.